Over the past few weeks, I've discovered a subgenre of horror that has lingered in the back of my mind. This horror runs through the veins of Showdown, haunting the player in a manner that is difficult to explain, but undeniably present. It is the same horror that prevents me from looking taxidermized animals in the eyes. It is a horror that lodges itself into your brain, like an arrow released from the bowstring of a hunter. It is nature horror. In the brainstorming stage of this video, I had a hard time determining what exactly nature horror was. I spent a few tedious hours researching whether anyone had defined the idea yet, and after realizing the public came up with a riveting definition of it's horror stories involving nature, I knew I had to come up with my own definition. I believe nature horror is a forced, uncomfortable awareness of the macabre realities of nature, resulting in a distrust of both flora and fauna. The earliest usage I could find of the genre nature horror was by Algernon Blackwood, a short story writer popular in the early 1900s. Blackwood became most renowned for writing a novella titled The Willows, about two friends embarking on a canoe trip in the wilderness. Although The Willows is a horror story, Blackwood spends less time describing a physical threat and more time describing the mental oppression of his environment. The protagonist explains that during his journey into the woods, the willow trees in particular inflict a deep sense of unease in his psyche. He states, "But my emotion, so far as I could understand it, seemed to attach itself more particularly to the willow bushes, to these acres and acres of willows, crowding, so thickly growing there, swarming everywhere that I could reach, pressing upon the river as though to suffocate it, standing in dense array mile after mile beneath the sky, watching, waiting, listening." These personified willow bushes became a threat to the protagonist's sanity. He can no longer trust his surroundings, no matter how familiar they used to be. Although the characters do end up confronting a physical threat, the part that piques my interest comes right before. The protagonist mulls over the sense of anxiety he has felt ever since setting foot on the shore. Yet it never left me quite. Even during the very practical business of putting up the tent in a hurricane of wind, and building a fire for the stew pot, it remained just enough to bother and perplex, and to rob a most delightful camping ground of a good portion of its charm. This fear is made manifest when mysterious figures appear in the boughs of the willow bushes. The protagonist identifies them as the personified elemental forces of this haunted and primeval region. He was right. There was more to the willows than mere bark and draping leaves. The horrors he imagined were real. And yet, his first impulse was not to run, but to fall down and worship. Alongside fear, great displays of nature also evoke reverence. The protagonist himself describes the sensation in an earlier encounter with the willows. With this multitude of willows, however, it was something far different, I felt. Some essence emanated from them that besieged the heart. A sense of awe awakened. True, but of awe touched somewhere by a vague terror. Algernon Blackwood's definition of nature horror strikes a nail on the head. For Blackwood, the identity of nature horror is rooted in a fearful reverence, caused when nature becomes the true threat. In the same way that Algernon Blackwood explores the horrors of flora, Showdown delves into the horrors of fauna. The game utilizes a trait system, where players who survive a match can equip small advantages for the next match. These traits include Gator Legs, which increases the player's speed in deep water, and Mithridatist, which reduces the time needed to recover from poisoning. Even though there are over 50 traits in the game, they are all tied together by their macabre themes. A majority of the traits include animals in their art, which seems normal due to the game's rule setting. However, look a little closer. The skill portrait for Lightfoot doesn't portray a cat. It is a cat with the separated jaw of a man and oddly human eyes. In the same vein, the Marksman Scopesmith trait does not merely depict a bird. It is a bird with human limbs emerging from shoulders that were never meant to house him. The bird's natural limbs still exist underneath, but they are usurped by those that are unnatural. The animals in Hunt Showdown are rarely just animals. The creatures hardly appear in their natural state. They are often grafted with human limbs or undergo mutations. Even in the adrenaline trait, the closest thing we get to a normal animal, the rabbit has hollow eyes and blood-matted fur. This perversion of nature is uncomfortable to watch. We've seen animals. We know what they're supposed to look like. We as individuals have a preconceived idea of what animals are, and generally we expect animals to act and look a certain way. Hunt doesn't let you sit in those comfortable expectations. Hunt asks, what if animals cross those lines? What would you do if you caught eyes with a deer in the woods and it possessed a human jaw? What would you think? What would you fear if your conceptions of what animals are was proven to be wrong in a one horrific moment? Hunt Showdown expounds upon this idea with its bosses. Each of Hunt's 4 bosses is designed around the idea of an animal. The assassin is an amalgamation of individual bugs, swarming to simulate a humanoid form. Much like the Dominik sisters in Resident Evil Village, this boss can send out clusters of insects to sting the player, poisoning them. The Butcher is a looming, massive creature with the head of a scathed pig. The Butcher wears a blood-soaked apron and carries many axes and knives lodged in the muscle of his arms. For any arachnophobes out there, I would look away for this next one. The Spider is a nightmarish mess of ribcage and spider leg. It bears the fleshy face of a human at the center of its pedipalps. Finally, the Scrapbeak is a feathery beast with a bird mask and the bodies of its victims on its back. The Scrapbeak possesses human arms, although they are buried underneath its lumbering figure. Each of these boss designs take a normal creature, like a pig or bird, and make them into grave threats. In the real world, pigs aren't dangerous, as well as birds. To a certain extent, we trust these animals. We hardly label them as sources of fear. However, Hunt Showdown subverts that trust and creates an ambiance of terror around creatures we see every day. In Hunt, getting too comfortable with familiar animals means death. This concept of subverted trust is pursued further with Hunt's sound alert system. Hunt is a multiplayer game that takes place on a giant map. On this map, multiple teams navigate the hordes of enemies and seek to kill the boss and extract that boss's bounty. Despite the abundance of zombies and disfigured creatures, the biggest threat to any player isn't the hellhounds or even the hive. It's being heard. A player can encounter sound traps that will emit a loud sound and visually inform other players of their location. One of these sound traps is a wounded horse, who will bray if alerted by a player. Another one of these threats is a pack of crows, who will not only create noise, but also fly directly upward if alerted, showing other players exactly where you are. In Hunt, being heard is the first step to being dead. When players know where you are, they will hunt you down to avoid a potential ambush. They will hide in the foliage, behind trees, and in the water, all out of sight. These sound traps are the biggest threat to any player, and they're not even caused by zombies or other typical dangers. They're caused by normal animals. A cage of dogs will bark if a player is in proximity, ducks will quack, horses will bray. Nature's not on your side. In Hunt, nature is responsible for the fear of the player. Whether it is the macabre art of grafted animals, or the mangled, semi-animalistic bosses, or the sound traps of wildlife, nature is at the heart of Hunt Showdown's horror. The horrors of nature are not limited to fiction. I experienced that same unease with taxidermy. When I see an animal so excellently preserved, with glossy eyes and perfectly brushed fur, I understand that sense of awe, touched somewhere by a vague terror. On one hand, the effort of the taxidermist is beautifully complex, from the pickling of the animal's pelt to wrapping the animal's skin around intricate forms that create the illusion of life. The inherent reverence that taxidermy bestows upon a dead creature is sobering. The act of taking a creature bound to be forgotten and restoring it to life is a great demonstration of honor. In undertaking such a task, the taxidermist is whispering to the animal, "I remember you, and others will too. I will not leave you to rot. You deserve more than that. It is a humbling act. It is almost sacred. At the same time, despite my efforts to perceive taxidermy with pure sobriety, my sense of awe is always followed up by quiet unease. Just like the man in the willows, once the immediate wonder of their great presence had passed, fear came down upon me with a cold rush. When staring at a deceased body, it is impossible to shake the awareness of that death. Although taxidermists are skilled artists, and over the years their techniques have allowed for greater realism, their imitation of life will never be perfect. Dead creatures will always look dead. The dark eyes of the mounted deer will always appear a little too blank. The feathers of the mounted pheasant will always be a little too sparse. Taxidermists may attempt to mask these details and convince the viewer that it looks alive, but their own work reveals the truth. Even though the motivations for taxidermy are founded upon respect, I believe it intrinsically falls under the scope of nature horror. We as individuals factually know that animals die. It's completely natural. And yet, when I see a dog's deceased body on the median of the road, it haunts me with a vague terror. Experiences like these force you to lock eyes with the darkest aspects of nature. Nature is no longer comfortable to think about. It is unsettling, and foreign, and brutal. It cannot be domesticated. It must stay feral. Gary Paulsen speaks of the unrestrained capacity of nature in his book Guts, which details his true stories of surviving in the wild. In the third chapter, titled Things That Hurt, Paulsen describes his experiences with nature at a young age. He was about 14, surrounded by half-tamed deer in a state park. Several other visitors accompanied him, feeding the deer candy. A young child in particular handed a small piece of mint candy to a deer, while his mother took their picture. The mother instructed the child to hold the candy away from him in order to capture a better photo. At this moment, Paulsen explains, the child took a mint from the package and held it out to the deer, which reached forward to take it. Then the child pulled it back. The deer lashed out with its front hooves, 2 slashing jabs so fast, so incredibly fast, that the only thing I would see in my life to compete with it was a rattlesnake strike. The pointed ends of the hooves were like small spears. They were in and out, and had killed the little boy before anybody could move. The boy and his mother were under the illusion that the deer shared their agenda. At the cost of the little boy's life, they forgot the ferality of nature. In that split second between the deer's hooves rising and the boy falling to the ground, I believe the mother experienced a definition of nature horror. A forced, uncomfortable awareness of the macabre realities of nature, resulting in a distrust of both flora and fauna. Moments before the incident, the mother most likely perceived deer as peaceful, curious beings. The rising of the deer's hooves, however, forces the mother to change her view of nature, readjusting her definition to accommodate the violence that creature is capable of. For as long as she lives, she will never see deer the same way again. To do so may be fatal. There is no doubt that nature is beautiful. Everything from the intricate textures of leaves to the different shades of green in a forest is breathtaking. The vastly unique types of animals that inhabit these spaces are equally as lovely. Everything in nature is fearfully and wonderfully made beyond words. And yet, this beauty coexists with a feral capacity for violence and death. The soft eyes of the deer know how to efficiently kill. The willow bushes press upon the river as though to suffocate it. The blood-matted rabbit runs from the predator. Nature horror exposes the morbid side of the natural world, challenging our comfortable expectations. It demonstrates that nature is not on our side. It is untamed, unpredictable, and capable of great brutality. Even months after experiencing nature horror, it remains lodged in the back of your mind, revived only in the pitch black of a camping ground or the blank stare of a mounted deer. It remains, just enough to bother and perplex. Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you know that I made a Patreon. So you can go check that out. There's different tiers that you can subscribe to. $7 tier will get your name in the credits, so definitely go check that out. I also made merch for the What Makes a House a Home video, so go check that out if you have the chance. Thank you!
Next, the skin gets soaked in a solution made of water, non-iodized salt, and what's essentially dishwashing soap. The salt pulls out the proteins and the soap degreases the skin. This part takes 4 to 6 hours for most animals, but a hippopotamus takes 3 days. Then comes the pickling. The skin soaks in a bath made of water, salt, and acid.